Greetings, Marsh here, and welcome to episode 133 of my modded Factorio playthrough. In this episode, we are going to cover how this dynamic LTN loading station works, including all of that complicated counter logic. Enjoy. Well, it's built in the same vein as these requesting stations up here, but the way that parking works is different. Right here, the trains park somewhere else, and then they slot in here and wait if there's a line. But since this is a provider station, the trains need to have a depot. Now, the depot could go anywhere, but I decided to integrate the depot into the station itself because otherwise, if this depot wasn't here, we would just have to put it somewhere else and then the trains would have to come here. Similar to how it is right here, where the depot is out of the way and then the trains have to make their way. So we only have the one train here, but in normal circumstances, there would be 6. We have 6 slots here because this is a 6 belt / 6 warehouse design, so it has room for 6 trains. Could this handle more than 6 warehouses or 6 item types? Absolutely, it would just be bigger. And I just cut it down because I knew that we would be bumping into things if I made it too long. So you certainly could handle as many resources as you want. Just note that the most it can sort through is 6 belts at a time, and that's the limiting factor. So once you've put 6 belts of resources into this thing, it might be better just to build a new setup rather than adding more items to it, because at some point it's just not going to be able to keep up with the amount of resources you want to go through it. So we have our depot, and that's where the 6 trains would park. I'll just put them in there now so it's more visual. And we would need to pipe fuel in here because trains are best fueled at the depot, so we would need to request fuel, and it's diagonal, which makes fueling them a little annoying, but we'll figure it out. So then when a request comes through, the train will pull forward, come in and park, and all of these warehouses are going to be as they are now, empty. And there's no circuit network connected to any of these warehouses. But when it parks, the output will be not only the train composition, but also what the train is asking for. And then it will send that signal along these wires. And there's 2 colored wires in the middle here, the green and the red. If you look very carefully, the red wire is going into the input. So the red wire is telling the station what it has available. So if you follow this red wire, and I kind of hover over it, you see how it basically goes to every single warehouse. It goes up here, down, down, and over. So there's lots of wires that aren't actually interconnected. There's wires, but they're not connected with each other, so you have to be careful here. But basically that red wire goes to every warehouse. It doesn't go to the middle ones because those are sorting warehouses, and in this situation, they are always empty. So the only warehouses it records are the item warehouses at the top and bottom. And then that green wire is the output. So in other words, when the train comes in, what is it asking for? And that goes down and goes to all the necessary locations. Now, I put a constant combinator in here so we can test how it works. Well, we've got a bunch of nanobots in here, so let's say a train comes in and it wants 200 nanobots. So we put in here 200, boom, and turn it on. So now it's got 200 on there, and this is simulating a train coming in for a request. And then this nanobot signal goes along the green wires and gets placed in all the necessary locations. Now, it can be difficult to follow all of this, but it's basically just 6 copies of the same thing. So instead of looking all of that, try to concentrate on this area right here. Now, unfortunately, this design requires each set of Nixie tubes and each set of combinators are set up for the resource that warehouse will handle. I did try to build this in a way that you didn't have to do that when you had a minimum amount of things that you had to update and set, and it worked, but it was much more complicated than this as far as the wiring was concerned. So I decided to just copy the same setup a bunch of times just to make it easier to follow. So let's say we got resources in here. Now, if you follow these belts on the side, these are the input belts, where they have belts going into each warehouse, and each warehouse handles 1 belt. You can certainly put more in there if you need to, but that's just how I had it set up. And then you see this green wire here just comes from the transport belt And all it's asking is how much do you want to have in the warehouse? And they're just set to everything and 32,000 as a default. So in other words, one train's worth of resources basically. And then there's the Nixie tube down here, which is saying what the capacity of the warehouse is. So that does need to be set, and I was testing it with iron. But if you come in here and say nanobots, we plop our nanobots in there, now it works. So I put 500 in, but you see some of them moved out on these unloaders. So now we have 476, and that's what these bottom Nixie tubes display on each warehouse. It's just the capacity. It's just so we don't have to hover over it. These are automatically set based on this network, but we do need to set these as well. Now I'm going to turn this off because the second I turn that on, things are going to happen. So we need to come through here and replace each one of these signals with whatever the resource is that that particular warehouse needs to handle. And I don't know, maybe there's a way of using less combinators than this, but I felt like I got it pretty narrow. So, to show how it works, we are requesting 200 nanobots. So what's going to happen is things are going to happen. Well, I'll explain the logic in a second, but what these two Nixie tubes down here are going to do is this top one is the C, or the count. This top one is going to say how many resources were actually supplied to the train. And the bottom one here is the request. In other words, how much is the train asking for? So this is just like a progress indicator for how far along it is. And to make this faster to diagnose, I'm going to take those out, because what happens when it gets a request is the resources go up, then they go into the sorting warehouses in the middle, and these guys in the back shoot their resources down. They make it to this warehouse right here and then get distributed evenly to all of the cars in the train. So I'm taking those out just so I could run it and then click on this warehouse and get the resources back. But it's all going to happen fairly quickly. But you flip the signal on, and then it got loaded. This started at 0, started counting. Now it went a little higher than that, because that's just how things are. You can't get an exact amount, you just get close. And now the remainder is 224. Now what's important is that this is a counting latch. So now that it's met the count, it stays on, because those resources, despite being removed from the warehouse, they actually still need to make it on the train. So this needs to stay on and active and remember the situation. So what happens is, this is basically saying, I have removed this much from my warehouse. It doesn't necessarily mean it's on the train. It's just not in the warehouse anymore. But as long as the train is in the station, it'll still be sending the signal for its request. So then what happens when the train leaves? The signal goes away, and then these get reset to 0, and the count is removed. So let's say another train came in and got loaded. It gets loaded with its 204. There's 20 left, and then it leaves. We turn it off, and we'll test it one more time. It's empty, and it loaded with 92. The reason why it wasn't 24 is because there were still resources on the belt here. So now it's only loaded it with 92, but nothing else is available. And that's basically how that works. So we're going to need to follow this along here to say exactly what it's doing. So I'm sorry if this is more complicated than you were hoping for, but with LTN and with counting, this is kind of what you need to do if you want this to work properly in this way. I kind of wanted to avoid doing too much dynamic loading stations because I knew how complicated it would be, but I also know that it's pretty cool, so I thought it would be worth covering. So what's happening here is there's two sets of belts that are wired up. The bottom belt, the green signal belt, is the on-off belt. This is the belt that is waiting for this logic to tell it to turn on. And then it's connected to the bottom here, and that's it. So that's all it's waiting for is do I turn on or do I turn off? The top belt, the red wire, is the counter. And it's actually a counting latch. So it's kind of hard to see with these things being vertical like this, but whenever you have a latch, you need to connect the input and the output of the same combinator together. This is exactly how the latch works for our power latch here, where we have this green wire where it's connected to the input and the output, and they go back and forth. So it's a little harder to see because these things are vertical, but that exists. The first thing here is turning on the whole setup. So in other words, it's looking for the request of the item that is in this warehouse. In other words, nanobots. And it's kind of a negative check. So it's checking to see, is there a nanobot request? Then fine, do nothing. But if there isn't a nanobot request, in other words, it's 0, then output the red signal. And then that red signal goes to the input of this combinator here, which is also taking the input from these belt counters. And what it's saying is if red signal is less than 1, so in other words, if the red signal is 0, then count it. And how you set up a counter is just say the input count is the output count. And when you connect the front and the back together, it remembers the count and adds the count together. So let's run this one more time. Kind of simulate that. So the input signal on this combinator is 200 because that is the request of the train. So it's not sending a red signal as an output. It's doing nothing. So it's letting the count happen as normal. So you come here where the input and the output signal is 204. And the reason why the input and the output is the same is because they are latched. Once the train leaves, it will receive a red signal, which means this will turn off and then the latch will disable and it will forget its memory and reset to 0. So that is why that exists there. And now we have the thing that is checking for the count and checking for the request. So that same green wire that came all the way from the station is coming down here for this request thing. And it's basically just converting the actual request of nanobots into R. And then sending it as an output. And this one on the left, checking for the count, is just taking the count and multiplying it by 1 and turning it into C. And the reason why these are separate is to insulate the counter from the train and to make it so that system can work. Now, you could do it other ways, like using negative numbers and having the numbers annihilate each other and whatnot, but I found that it wasn't as reliable as doing it this way. Now, I'm sure there's 15 different ways of doing this, but I found it easier just to take the count signal and convert it into a C and take the request signal and turn it into an R. So then the output of both of those combinators goes into the actual combinator that turns things on and off. And it's pretty simple. Is the count less than the request? If so, send a green signal. And then that green signal goes back to these belts and turns them on and sends them down. And then these Nixie tubes are just reading the C signal and the R signal. So you see with all these wires that, I don't know if there's a mod that has more wire colors than just red and green, but there's a lot going on here with these wires, and you have to be very careful that they don't cross because they only work in a very specific way. And that's basically how that station works. It's pretty neat. I could talk about this all day, but you can only understand so much by watching that. So let's get rid of this combinator. We have checked that it works, and I did check each warehouse. So if you do have something like this set up, it might be worth going through each warehouse to make sure that they are all set up correctly here. I think I got all my nanobots back. It's definitely something you don't want to have resources mixed up in. Because the whole point of this is that it doesn't mix up resources, that it very specifically keeps everything separate. So we need to set this up and get resources in here, and this will be a great way to test the output of this whole setup because we need to fill this entire warehouse is full of circuit boards. So as far as all the things we need, we definitely want these circuit boards and the electronic circuit boards for sure. So all of the brown boards, and certainly the final product of the white boards. Sometimes it can be hard to remember what all of those are, so maybe it might be better to come here. So we definitely need basic circuit boards and basic electronic boards, and of course electronic circuit boards. But what about these circuit boards here? Now they do go into things. We click here and it goes into a few things. But notice a trend, they're all robot stuff. So with these brains, if you click on a brain here, you see that it basically requires electronic components. Like literally electronic components, but what I mean is electronic resources. So solder, transistors, these are all things we make right here, right now. So why in the world would we want to make these combat brains somewhere else when we've already got all of the resources right here to make them? And that basically applies to all of these brains. Then the other things are roboports. Well, it's the same thing. Circuit boards, solder, and a module case, and those are for modules, and modules use pretty much the same resources as electronics do, which is why I want to make them here. So the only thing that circuit boards go into, besides electronic circuit boards, are other electronics that we can make right here. So we actually have no need to put them on a train. So right now, it looks like we only have 3 resources that we need to put in here. So let's get this set up. Well, first we need to line up the belts here. And I think this is a situation where we needed to do a loop back here, because these electronics were moving forward to get turned into the more advanced version. But now that they're used up, we need to turn them around and send them back. Let's just put it down here. Easy enough. I don't want to put it at the very bottom because that might actually get in the way of some of these machines. That tends to be, if there's going to be any conflict, it's going to be down there, so it might just be easier to put the belts on the top here. So we have to do our loop back. And then we need to go into the station here, so I guess it would make sense to go right there. And let's try to make it a little symmetrical. So we'll put the higher tier version right there. And then we can put the whiteboards. How about right in there? Okay, I think most of it's set up properly. Where we have the basic boards over here. So those 3 are set. And then the warehouse Nixie tube on the top here needs to be set, which it is. Then the advanced boards right here. With that one set, which it is. Then white circuits. And then that one. And set like it is. So we connect all this together and they'll start filling up. Nothing will happen, but we'll see the count going up. And they will fill up to 32,000 or a full train's worth of resources. And that is going to run for some time. And this will be an excellent situation to see how our factory operates with everything moving at full speed. And it looks like we're starting to get requests now, because these resources are going to start being reduced, and we'll get to see how it operates. Because before it was more of a test, and now it's actually producing a very significant, like a full train of each of these resources is a pretty significant amount to create, so we're definitely going to see how things work. We do need to get the fuel in here, and not entirely sure how to do that. Actually, we might not have to fuel the trains up here at all. It does make sense to fill them up at a depot, but because this is a dynamic loading station, it means that every train still needs to come through here to get loaded, and that'll be plenty of time to get the fuel put in, assuming we can make it work with all these belts. It's a little less practical to do it in a situation like this, because that means we would have a belt going across the entire length of this, and that's just so much fuel and just so much belt to put fuel in there compared to filling them all up at this central location. And since this is a central location, it seems like it would be just fine of a location to fill up the train. So we do something like this, and got another request. And have this go all the way back here. And yeah, the one disadvantage of doing it this way is the trains won't be pre-filled with fuel. We'll have to fill them up first. It won't just start automatically. But I mean, that's easy enough to do. It just needs one piece of fuel in there, and then the process will begin. So we need a request depot. And unfortunately, it looks like I didn't bring any drones. So we'll have to go back and get more. But you see, this is working pretty well, where the basic board is fairly limited. And that's fine because we're actually leeching off of the main line, where this is set up to 30 items a second. So this should be full. And since this is exactly matched, that it'll make sense that this will be drained out and stop. And then we have about 15 a second of these white circuits, which seems to be loading at that rate. Inserters are going nuts. It does look like there is a slight limitation here where we're running at exactly 30 copper coils a second. It might be one of those weird things where technically the belt is fast enough, but the inserters can't quite keep up. So it's like 99% or something like that. Like, you see how this guy in the back doesn't always get his copper coils, but I think if we upgraded this to blue belts or faster inserters or yada yada yada, I think it would be better. But it's not that the machine is too slow, it's just the inserters can't get them on there fast enough. So that happens quite a bit with electronic assemblers, is that you only get your 2 slots, and that can make it difficult to fill up belts, even though on paper you should be able to fill them up. So those are operating pretty well. Oh, this isn't working, but I guess that's because that belt is faced the wrong way. Well, that should help the output. As far as this setup here, it looks like it's not quite getting enough electronic components. And there could also be a limitation of the belt here. Let's try some stack inserters. Yeah, seems to be about right. Sometimes you have to be really particular with how you have these things set up to get it exactly maxed out on a belt, but it is what it is. It's not always possible to easily max things out, even though you have calculated that you can. This really just needs faster belts. If it was faster belts, then it would be fine. Whenever you get close to the maximum output of a belt is when sometimes you can run into oddities like that. But close enough. I'm not too picky about getting it absolutely maxed out. We're getting lots of requests here, because now that this thing's running at full blasts, we're getting lots of activity. Actually, I wonder if just save some time and make some transport drones right here, because I don't think we need a ton of them. Because I do want to get this process started. So we'll put the request depot here. Request those fuel blocks. Put some drones in. And that'll get started up and eventually, because this is really far away, so it might take a while for that process to start. Eventually the resources will get here. But it looks like we're starting to receive deliveries. And it took a while to get here, but, you know, there's still 6.5K of copper coil, so despite the fact we're using it at almost the maximum capacity of the belt, the train still had plenty of time to get loaded and get down here and get things topped off before it ran into problems. So it seems like it's working pretty well. Just putting a third electronics assembling machine in here might help with the output of this. So if we just put another one right up here, definitely want to put it up here so it has more room on the belt, because more of the resources would have been taken up. So we want to space them out a little bit. Make some electronics assemblers. I'll just make the first tier, because that's what's up here already. And hopefully that helps out a little bit. Well, that train's gone. And now its resources are just making its way into the warehouse. And we got more boards on the way. Seems to be unloading properly. Well, I think we've done basically everything we need to do here. I mean, we can sit here and watch this get loaded, but this is a provider station, so it's not like anything's going to happen once we get it set up, because there will be no requests for these items. We are simply getting prepared for the next set of science and making sure these resources are going to be available. So we need to get the LTN combinator in there. And actually, since this is a provider station, assuming this is set up correctly, we won't get a bunch of random trains starting to run when we put this in here. But let's make sure. Let's turn it off for a second to make sure everything is set up correctly. Let's see. Well, we need to make a new network here. Let's just make it electronic circuit boards. And it's a provider station. The limit of trains is going to be 6, because that's how many parking spaces we have. The provide stack threshold is 40, which means it will not send a train here until it has at least a fourth of a train ready. And what's interesting is that the dynamics of how a partially loaded train work is different for a station like this compared to the stations down here. So let's say a train was sent down here for these gunmetal plates, and let's say the request was for a fourth of a train or 40 stacks, and that was all that was available. Well, when the train gets here, more resources are going to be produced and available, and it will keep putting those resources in the train, so that train will end up sitting there as long as it doesn't sit idle for 2 seconds. That train will still be there, receiving resources, and it'll eventually get filled up, because this kind of station doesn't control the amount of resources that gets placed on the train. However, a counting station absolutely will. So let's say there's only a fourth of a train worth of, white circuits available, which are in this warehouse right here. When the train comes in, it's going to say, I want exactly this much, or let's say 40 stacks. It will supply just 40 stacks and then turn off, and then that train leaves. So that train won't be trapped at the station waiting while it's getting loaded with, let's say piddly little amounts of circuit boards like this that are just barely not letting it do the 2-second timeout. So definitely a counting station like this is much more accurate and much better when it comes to partially filled trains. Lots of stuff happening. Just seems like it's all working normally. There's nothing too exciting about it. I mean, it's really cool, but once it's working properly, there's nothing you have to do. It just operates like it should, which is nice. So we have that set. Now, when it comes to any loading station, any dynamic loading station anyway, you have to have a way of making sure that every single resource that gets supplied gets put on the train, because if it's not, it's going to be stuck in inserters and it's going to find its way on the wrong train. So one thing you can do with LTN is use this locked slots per wagon setting. Now, when you look at it, you might think, oh, well, that's going to lock a slot off. It's going to do this. But that's not actually what it does. It doesn't do anything as far as locking the train off. What it does is LTN knows how big any given train car is. So when you have locked slots per wagon, basically that says whenever you're making requests, don't make a request for this many slots per train. So if you have a train come in, and let's say that, and the train holds 160 stacks, at most it'll only actually ever be loaded with 159, because LTN will assume that one of those slots cannot be used. Now, if you have a station like our unrestricted loading stations for plates, this setting doesn't matter because the train's just going to sit there and get fully loaded. It's not going to affect it. This setting only matters when it comes to what the actual requests are going to be. So these in transit, these are the actual request numbers that the train are trying to get loaded with. So by adjusting that setting, it means that it will take a stack out of each car for these settings, and it will actually end up being empty space because this thing will count the resources that go into it. So it will count the resources in a way to not give it an entirely full train. And that is because, as we were testing here, just because this thing has a counter doesn't mean it's going to give the exact amount. It's going to be very close, but it could be a couple items too many. And if anything, it is going to be a couple items too many because it's comparing. So C has to be greater than R before it's going to stop. So it's pretty much always going to have a little bit over. And that's, fine. You just need to set this up to prevent that. So by having this lock slots to 1, it means that every train will always leave with a small amount of empty space in it, and any resources that are removed from these warehouses will actually make it to the train and get placed on it. Let's see here. Although before we leave, we probably want to make sure these trains are fueled, or at least have those fuel blocks. So we're really far away. So where are... Oh, man. All this time, and now the fuel is just now getting here. So now the drones are going to have to go back and get the fuel blocks. Oof. So let's get all these trains set to automatic. And we need another LTN combinator here to mark this as a depot. Depot's on. We'll set it to the number 5 ID for these circuits. And now they're all blue, showing that trains are properly parked here and ready to go. Well, it's time to make a quick trip down then, so we can get some fuel blocks to load them in. And actually, since we're up here, might want to switch this station out with the, let's see here, the non-LTN setting. So I kind of want to put that in there, move it over, put that one back, copy it in. Now we have bombodium load on a non-LTN station. Alright, get up here. I need to get some fuel blocks. It's interesting how we got a request for slightly less than a full amount of copper wire, presumably because it wasn't available. Okay, let's grab a few fuel blocks here. Just enough to place in the trains so they will operate. There we go. So now those trains will respond to requests when they are received. And it looks like we filled up with the brown circuits, and now it's just topping off everything else. So that's kind of what it looks like, where it got above 32,000, just a tiny bit, and then it stops. So it's got a full train worth of resources ready to go. So now we need to plan for our science, and I'll make a new line here just to include the military science in the calculation. So we want red, green, and black. And I think we were planning on like 3 per second, because that's kind of what we're doing now, so we might as well see if we can make that work. So we'll need 20 assembling machines for the red packs, and we'll be able to use these electronic assembling machines, and really don't need that many of them to make that happen. And then we'll also need to chop them up from coils, which doesn't take very many machines. It looks like this recipe could be doubled up fairly easily, but good enough. So we need to make the circuits, and let's see, we'll need a assembling machine to chop up each one of these individual resources. Don't really need much of one, but we need to make sure to keep them all separated, because this is for our actual design build. We need to make sure we have all this considered. And then finally, we also need these reaction nodes, which we'll put on a separate line, because each of these come from their own set of coils as well. And actually, this one is a little wrong there. And there we go. You can see that isn't very much for all of those coils, but that's because red and green is fairly easy. So when we get to the black stuff, that it starts getting pretty hard. So we need test target plating, which is made from subplate, steel, brass, and then all of that invar. So weapon testing, subplate is more brass, more invar, and that's a ton of brass for that one. It also creates waste byproducts here. We'll see about processing that here or somewhere else. But we'll come back up here and handle weapons testing module, which needs the testing circuit, carbon and basic electronic boards. And then the circuit board is made from carbon and circuit boards. So lots of carbon for that. Lots of byproducts. So our factory might be a little short on carbon, we'll have to see, because that also requires a decent amount of carbon. But yeah, that's where all that invar plate's going to go. So we are going to tear through our nickel pretty easily. And then it's going to create some byproducts. Let's see here. We'll set this to ingredient input and lock it. And the question is, do we want to process it here or somewhere else? It depends on how it is going to be returned. Let's see, 19 per second is a decent amount. So 400 divided by 19.5. So every 20 seconds it's going to send a drone. So we might want to put this on a train. But the question is where would that train go and how would the resources actually get here? Because they would have to be supplied almost down here, basically, and put them back on the bus. I mean, we do have the rail right here. It wouldn't be that difficult to at least extend this down here, and that would get them a heck of a lot closer by going this whole distance. And then we'll just have to cover this distance, because I'm thinking we can get the resources off the train and then just send it on a belt. It would be a fairly long belt, but it's still too much for drones. So we can send it like around here, down, and then in. So we'll want to take care of the other byproduct as well via input. So 1 assembling machine for the copper and 6.5 for the iron. So we're actually going to get a decent amount of the resources back that go into this. So now we have a general idea of the resources that this is going to need to take. Where it's going to need iron coils, copper coils, tin coils, lead coils, tinned wire coils, and then steel, brass, and invar, all of which come from the metal bus. And then the carbon train's going to have to make a trip up here. And then these circuits are going to come from this dynamic loading station here of basic boards and basic electronic boards. The great thing about the receiving stations, the unloading stations, is it doesn't matter where all these came from. They will all slot in with each other. So we just look at the number of resources we have. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And since our stations handle 8 at a time, or they're designed for 8 at a time, we'll need that. But because this invar plate is a fairly large amount of plates, that might count as 2 slots. So instead of 11, it's more like 12 for all of this. But we have an idea. Basically, kind of something like this, really. We just need to have 2 stations like this and maybe space them back a little bit more so there's room for stuff. And then we need to figure out where are we going to place it. There's space right here. We could kind of slice it in here, but it's going to cover up some of those resources. Or we can slice it in down here. Maybe cover up some resources. See, there's bigger crotiniums available. How big is the setup going to be? Well, certainly the red and green science isn't going to take up much space. That's actually not too bad. Where it's like 20, 18, and 14. I mean, just this alone is 112. So I guess it depends on how compact they were, but it actually doesn't seem like it's going to be that big of a build. So I don't want to include it on this bus. I want to try to separate the buses, especially because as we have more and more science types, it's just going to get bigger and more complicated. So yeah, let's see if we can try to build it down here. And then we're just going to have to see how everything lines up, basically. So probably the first thing is to grab a pattern of this. That will give us the idea of how much space it's going to take. And really, might as well grab pretty much the whole thing, because we're going to need exactly all of this. And get rid of the unnecessary stuff from the other station. And that should cover all of our input needs. And then we will have the output of copper and iron. But since those resources aren't actually on the LTN network, they get processed into their final state before they ever get to a train, that we probably don't need an LTN train just for those things. So we could just make whatever train station fits, basically. Oh, hey, look at that. There's some fuel here. So that process can begin. But we have been spending time making landfill. So hopefully we'll have more freedom about where we expand. But that's going to have to wait until the next episode. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you later.